Hey guys, this is Tommy with Tommy Nation Politics. How's everyone doing today?
The American Civil Liberties Union says the Biden administration has agreed to allow more than 7,000 asylum seekers stranded in Mexico to enter the U.S. each month. Nearly 250 vulnerable migrants will be allowed into the U.S. on a daily basis. It's part of negotiations in an ongoing lawsuit brought by the ACLU to challenge a Trump-era policy known as Title 42. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez joins me now with more. Hi there, Camilo. So what exactly is Title 42 and which migrants are exempted from it?
Yes, good evening, Elaine. Title 42 is a public health authority dating back to the late 19th century that the Trump administration invoked in March of 2020 at the start of the coronavirus pandemic. The Trump administration argued then that it could effectively suspend U.S. immigration and asylum laws through this public health authority and that it could use it to turn away migrants and asylum seekers without allowing them to request U.S. protection along the U.S.-Mexico border and along the border with Canada, to that matter of fact, as well. The Biden administration, Elaine, has continued to implement the Title 42 policy when it comes to single adult migrants and families with children, but it has declined so far to reinstate the practice of using Title 42 to expel unaccompanied children, a practice that 3 federal judges have ruled is likely illegal. And so now the Biden administration, as you mentioned during the introduction to the segment, is now allowing some vulnerable asylum seekers to enter the country, and it is exempting them from this Title 42 process.
So that raises the question, Camilo, which asylum seekers does the Department of Homeland Security consider as vulnerable migrants?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. The American Civil Liberties Union says that the asylum seekers are identified by NGOs and other groups in Mexico working with migrants and asylum seekers, and these are migrants who are deemed to be vulnerable because of acute medical conditions, because they face some type of harm like kidnapping, extortion, or even assault in Mexico. Remember that some of these migrants are sent to some of Mexico's more dangerous areas, including the state of Tamaulipas, which has a level 4 travel warning from the U.S. State Department, and because of the age of their children. If some families have children that are tender age, as the government calls them, they are also eligible for this relief.
As Israel-Palestine clashes rages on. Global calls for calm are deepening. Reactions from all around the world are pouring in, and worries are growing about further fracturing in one of West Asia's most intractable struggles. France has now stepped up its efforts to call for an immediate de-escalation of this conflict. The country has proposed a resolution with the UN Security Council in coordination with Egypt and Jordan, calling for a ceasefire. According to the resolution, the three countries agreed on three simple elements. The shooting must stop, the time has come for a ceasefire, and the UN Security Council must take up the issue. The statement reads out that French President Emmanuel Macron and his Egyptian counterpart Al-Sisi, who is in Paris for a summit on Africa, agreed on the resolution in a video conference. Remember, Macron has underlined the importance of Egyptian mediation after talks in Paris with Sisi, as it has been calling for a rapid ceasefire for several days. Meanwhile, foreign ministers of the European Union have also called for a ceasefire and boosted humanitarian aid for Gaza. However, they have failed to reach the unanimity which could have given the EU leverage in peacemaking efforts. The truce was met with a hurdle when Hungary, another ally of Israel in the bloc, declined to join the other 26 foreign ministers. Hungarian foreign minister has accused the European Union of giving out what it called one-sided statements. The division between the European bloc was at a public display after EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell conceded that Hungary was alone among the 27 nations to not endorse his remarks.
Madam President, I come to the floor this afternoon to talk about two issues of vital importance to the United States and the world. First, I want to say a few words about the current violence paralyzing Israel and the Palestinian territories. But then I want to spend the bulk of my remarks on the future of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. First, here in America, our hearts are breaking for Israelis and Palestinians. The images are just bone-chilling. Rockets and interceptors streaking across the night sky, parents huddled with their children as air raid sirens ring out. Tragic images of innocent Israeli and Palestinian civilians, including children injured or killed in the blasts. For many Americans who are turning on the news this week, it might appear that the events of the last few days erupted almost overnight. And while tensions are now reaching a fever and deadly pitch, this cataclysm has been long in the making. And no party, including the United States of America, has completely clean hands. Zero-sum politics has driven both the decision-making of the Netanyahu government and Palestinian leadership, to the extent that there is such thing as Palestinian leadership. And those decisions have led us to this crisis. Over and over, Prime Minister Netanyahu has pushed Israeli settlements further into territory historically considered reserved for a future Palestinian state. The Israeli government, increasingly reliant on right-wing zero-sum political constituencies for its survival, also stepped up campaigns to remove Palestinians from areas in East Jerusalem as a means to undermine the Palestinian claim to that section of the ancient city as the capital of a future state. The spark that lit the match of the existing conflagration was the Israeli effort to remove Palestinian families from their homes in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and replace them with Israeli settlers. In February, an Israeli court ordered Palestinian families in that neighborhood to vacate their homes by May 2nd, or they would be forcibly removed. Protests began and spread to other cities in Israel with large Arab populations, while the Palestinian families awaited a final ruling from the Israeli Supreme Court. As these protests spread and grew in size, Israeli police adopted some tactics that we have seen on display here in the United States. An overly securitized approach that only escalated rather than diffused the tension. Those crackdowns led to more protests and more clashes in a cycle that continued and continued. Then, Israeli security forces stormed Islam's third holiest site in Jerusalem during Ramadan prayers. Now, the Israelis contend that they were responding to rock throwing from Palestinians inside. The Palestinians argue that it was the other way around. But whatever happened, at the end of that night, more than 330 Palestinians and 22 Israelis had been injured. The story of the Palestinians' conduct over the last decade is just as important in understanding the roots of the existing crisis. Fatah, the main political party representing Palestinians, has failed the people that it represents. Rife with internal conflict and corruption, Fatah lost its mandate to govern Gaza in 2006 when Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, beat Fatah in parliamentary elections there that year. Hamas refuses to recognize the right of Israel to exist and advocates for the armed rebellion of Palestinians against Israel. Fatah, under pressure from Hamas to take the more extreme position, spent most of the last decade refusing any and all chance to negotiate with the Israelis, preferring to sit on the sidelines and nurture grievances. And they were unable to deliver any real economic benefit to the people under their charge in the West Bank. And the resulting desperation of Palestinians fed this grievance culture even more.
Hey guys, this is Tommy with Tommy Nation Politics. How's everyone doing today? Tommy Nation Politics.
Hi everyone, I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is facing more questions about Israel as strikes continue and peace talks break down. According to the White House, President Biden expressed support for a ceasefire in his call with Israel's Prime Minister Monday. But the U.S. ally says it will keep striking Gaza until Hamas rocket fire stops. In Israel, 2 workers from Thailand were killed earlier in the day. 3 Palestinians died and 72 were injured in West Bank clashes Tuesday. Arab workers went on strike calling for an end to the bombardment of Gaza. President Biden spoke with the only Palestinian American in Congress, Michigan Democrat Rashida Tlaib, for nearly 8 minutes on the tarmac before an infrastructure event Tuesday. Tlaib has been one of the president's harshest critics over his support for Israel. Mr. Biden complimented her during a speech after the conversation.
I admire your intellect, I admire your passion, and I admire your concern for so many other people. And it's from my heart, I pray that your grandmom and family are well. I promise you I'm going to do everything to see that they are on the West Bank. You're a fighter, and God, thank you for being a fighter.
In Washington, a bipartisan deal to form a commission to study the January 6th Capitol insurrection could be in trouble after the top House Republican criticized the plan. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says he does not support the deal agreed to by New York Republican John Katko. It would have given Republicans equal control over the inquiry into the Capitol attack. Here's how Congressman Katko defended the plan.
I can't state this more plainly enough. This is about facts. It's not about partisan politics. It's about making the Capitol Police complex stronger. It's about making the Capitol safer. It's about making the Capitol Police Department or officers, which by admission is a very dysfunctional group right now with 92% of their members having no confidence in their leadership, going to make them better. We have to make them better. We owe it to the line people who risk their lives to protect us every single day.
Nancy Cordes, Catherine Herridge, and Zeke Miller join me now. Nancy is CBS News Chief White House Correspondent. Catherine is a CBS News Senior Investigative Correspondent. And Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. Welcome to you all. Another busy news day. Catherine, let me start with you. Now that Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is attacking this bipartisan agreement, where does the fate of this commission stand now? And how are things looking in the Senate?
Well, Elaine, it's likely to pass in the House regardless of Leader McCarthy's lack of support for the commission. What we know through our reporting is that when you look at the numbers, the Democrats in the House have the numbers that they need, and it's an almost certainty that some House Republicans will join them. The issue has always been the focus for Republicans. They believe that the commission should not have simply a narrow focus on January 6th. They want something much broader that would also encompass what they describe as the political violence from last summer. Elaine.
And Catherine, if this commission ends up actually happening, what sort of power will they have? And what are they attempting to learn beyond what's been revealed by the ongoing criminal cases stemming from January 6th?
Well, they're both excellent questions. I'll take them one at a time. For right now, the subpoena issue, it appears to be settled. There are really two methods right now to issue a subpoena. One would be with the joint agreement of the chair appointed by the Democrats and then the vice chair appointed by Republicans, or by a majority of the commissioners. And as you know, they're equally split between the parties. The concern on both sides is that the subpoena process could become weaponized and for political reasons. And that's a very real prospect, because when you look at the timeline, the 9/11 Commission took nearly 2 years. And I would argue the amount of evidence here is so significant, you could be looking at a similar timeline, which, guess what, bumps us right up against the midterm elections. So there could be a lot of temptation to really politicize that investigative subpoena process. Finally, it's not clear what they will learn that the congressional committees could not uncover on their own, because I think one of the major hurdles, based on our reporting here at CBS News, is that you have the ongoing litigation of the Capitol rioters. So some evidence will simply be out of reach of congressional investigators until those cases are resolved. And just as a point of context, what we know through our reporting is that it's been very challenging to try and reach plea agreements with some of the defendants because there's simply so much evidence, and it's been very difficult for the Justice Department to get that discovery to those parties so they can make a decision. So there really, I think, is a lesson here for Congress as well.
Serve in Congress, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm actually, I believe, the second, but I am the only Palestinian American member of Congress now, and my mere existence has disrupted the status quo. I am so personal for me. I am a reminder to colleagues that Palestinians do indeed exist, that we are human, that we are allowed to dream. We are mothers, daughters, granddaughters. We are justice seekers and are unapologetically about our fight against oppressions of all forms. And colleagues, Palestinians aren't going anywhere, no matter how much money you send to Israel's apartheid government. If we are to make good on our promises to support equal human rights for all, it is our duty to end the apartheid system that for decades has subjected Palestinians to inhumane treatment and racism. Reducing Palestinians to live in utter fear and terror of losing a child, being indefinitely detained or killed because of who they are, and the unequal rights and protections they have under Israeli law. It must end. One of Israel's most prominent human rights organizations, B'Tselem, has declared Israel an apartheid state. Human Rights Watch recently recognized it too. This is what Palestinians living under Israel's oppression have been telling us for decades. I have been told by some of my colleagues who dispute the truth about segregation, racism, and violence in Israel towards Palestinians that I need to know the history. What they mean, unintentionally or not, is that Palestinians do not have the right to tell the truth about what happened to them during the founding of Israel. They are, in effect, they erase the truth about ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Israel, that some refer to as the Nakba, our catastrophe. As Palestinians talk about our history, know that many of my Black neighbors, indigenous communities, may not know what we mean by Nakba, but they do understand what it means to be killed, expelled from your home, land, made homeless, and stripped of your human rights. My ancestors and current family in Palestine deserve the world to hear their history without obstruction. They have a right to be able to explain to the world that they are still suffering, still being dispossessed, still being killed as the world watches and does nothing. As Peter Beinart, an American of Jewish faith, writes, quote, "When you tell a people to forget its past, you are not proposing peace. You are proposing extinction. The Palestinian story is that of being made a refugee on the lands you called home. We cannot have an honest conversation about U.S. military support for the Israeli government today without acknowledging that for Palestinians, the catastrophe of displacement and dehumanization in their homeland has been ongoing since 1948. To read the statements from President Biden, Secretary Blinken, General Austin, and leaders of both parties, you'd hardly know Palestinians existed at all. There has been no recognition of the attack on Palestinian families being ripped from their homes in East Jerusalem right now, or home demolitions. No mention of children being detained or murdered. No recognition of a sustained campaign of harassment and terror by Israeli police against worshipers, kneeling down and praying and celebrating their holiest days in one of their holiest places. No mention of Al-Aqsa being surrounded by violence, tear gas, smoke, while people pray. Can my colleagues imagine if it was their place of worship filled with tear gas? Could you pray as stun grenades were tossed into your holiest place? Above all, there has been absolutely no recognition of Palestinian humanity. If our own State Department can't even bring itself to acknowledge the killing of Palestinian children is wrong, well, I will say it for the millions of Americans who stand with me against the killing of innocent children, no matter their ethnicity or faith. I weep for all the lives lost under the unbearable status quo, every single one, no matter their faith, their background. We all deserve freedom, liberty, peace, and justice, and it should never be denied because of our faith or ethnic background. No child, Palestinian or Israeli, whoever they are, should ever have to worry that death will rain from the sky. How many of my colleagues are willing to say the same, to stand for Palestinian human rights as they do for Israelis? There is a crushing dehumanization to how we talk about this terrible violence. The New York Post reported the Palestinian death toll as Israeli casualties. ABC says that Israelis are, quote, killed, while Palestinians simply, quote, die, as if by magic, as if they were never human to begin with. Help me understand the math. How many Palestinians have to die for their lives to matter? Life under apartheid strips Palestinians of their human dignity. How would you feel if you had to go through dehumanizing checkpoints 2 blocks from your own home to go to the doctor or travel across your own land? How would you feel if you had to do it while pregnant in the scorching heat as soldiers with guns controlled your freedom? How would you feel it if you lived in Gaza, where your power and water might be out for days or weeks at a time, where you were cut off from the outside world by inhumane military blockade? Meanwhile, Palestinians' rights to nonviolent resistance have been curtailed and even criminalized. Our party leaders have spoken forcefully against BDS, calling its proponents anti-Semitic, despite the same tactics being critical to ending the South African apartheid mere decades ago. What we are telling Palestinians fighting apartheid is the same thing being told to my Black neighbors and Americans throughout that are fighting against police brutality here. There is no form of acceptable resistance to state violence.
Hey guys, this is Tommy with Tommy Nation Politics. How's everyone doing today?